The cry in the shadows, the market was loud and full of shouting voices. Aliens of many kinds walked past dirty cages and small tents. Some sold weapons, others sold food, but one area was different. It was the slave market. Here, weak and broken, creatures were sold for the lowest price. Some were too old. Some were sick. And some, like her, were simply forgotten. She sat against a cold metal wall, her arms tightly wrapped around a small child. Her skin was dusty and cracked. Her hair was matted and dry. Her eyes were wide but empty. The baby in her arms was not crying loudly. It was a soft, broken sound, like it was too tired to scream. She rocked the baby slowly, whispering something in her alien language, though no one listened. The other vendors didn't even count her anymore. They had tried to sell her many times, but no one wanted her. Broken, they called her. She doesn't talk, doesn't move, just sits with that useless child. Waste of space. But one man noticed Ethan was just passing through. He wasn't there to buy anything. He had come for fuel and food supplies for his small ship. He didn't. Like slave markets, he didn't believe in them. But something strange made him stop. A sound, a soft, weak cry. It was not a normal cry. It sounded more like pain and fear mixed together, like someone giving up. Ethan turned and saw the source of the sound. He looked at the alien woman sitting in the corner. She didn't beg. She didn't look up. She just held the baby close like her life depended on it. People walked past her like she wasn't even there. But Ethan couldn't. He walked closer and bent down. The baby's skin had strange green marks. Fever, maybe. The woman looked thin and sick herself. But she wasn't crying. Her face was calm, almost like she had already died inside. Ethan reached into his pack and pulled out a bottle of clean water and a wrapped food bar. He held them out. She blinked slowly, then she took them, but didn't eat. Instead, she broke the bar into pieces and put them gently into the baby's mouth. She opened the water slowly and helped the child drink first. Ethan was surprised. Most starving people would eat first. But not her. One of the vendors saw what Ethan was doing and laughed. "You want to buy that one? Go ahead, human." "She's broken. Doesn't even have a name. Just dead weight." "The kid's half dead too." Ethan stood up. "What's her story?" He asked. The vendor shrugged. "She used to be something. A mate of a warrior or noble, I think. Then he died in the war. She was captured, lost her mind. They tried to train her, but she wouldn't speak or obey. Now nobody wants her, not even the other slaves." Ethan looked at the woman again. She still wasn't looking at him, but she was humming now. A soft sound like a lullaby. The baby had closed its eyes. He could see her hands shaking from weakness, but she still rocked her child slowly. "I want her," Ethan said. Raised an eyebrow. "Really? You can take her." "One credit is more than she's worth." Ethan paid. He didn't know why. Maybe it was the way she protected the child. Maybe it was the cry that touched his heart. Or maybe it was the way she didn't ask for help, but still gave what little she had to someone smaller and weaker than herself. The vendor handed him a worn-out data chip. "Here, ownership confirmed. But don't say I didn't warn you." Ethan walked back to the woman. She didn't run. She didn't thank him. She just watched as he knelt beside her and slowly reached out his hand. For a moment, she flinched. Then she allowed him to lift the baby. He held the child close to his chest and offered his other hand to her. She looked at it for a long moment. Her eyes were large and sad. But she stood up, slowly, like her legs had not worked in a long time. Her steps were weak. But she followed. The crowd barely noticed them leave. Just another slave, just another fool. But Ethan felt something change inside him. He didn't know her name, her story, or even what kind of alien she was, but he knew she had once loved someone. He could see it in the way she held her child. And he believed that kind of love didn't die so easily. As they walked out of the shadows of the market, the baby let out a small, peaceful sigh. And for a second, Ethan thought he saw something in the woman's eyes. A spark. Something still alive. Something. Waiting. She had no name anymore. She had no name anymore. Once, she had a title, a family, and a place in her people's strong society. But that life was gone, burned away in the fire of war. No one called her by name now. She was just a number in the slave trader's file, a thing to be sold or thrown away. She had stopped speaking long ago, not because she couldn't, but because no one listened. Ethan didn't ask her name either. He knew she wouldn't answer. She looked at the ground when spoken to. She walked slowly behind him with her child in her arms, careful and silent like a shadow. It wasn't fear that kept her quiet, it was emptiness. As if all words had died inside her. He brought her to a small room in his ship. It wasn't big, but it was clean and warm. He gave her a blanket, a bed, and more food. She took it all without complaint and gave it to her child first, just like before. The baby's eyes were dull, its breathing weak. But she never cried. She simply held the child against her chest, rocking it gently, humming the same soft tune. Again and again, Ethan tried to speak to her that night. "You're safe now," he said. "No one will hurt you here." She didn't respond. "I don't want anything from you," he added. "I just want you to rest." Still, no reply. He sighed and left her alone, closing the door behind him. The next morning he found her sitting on the floor, awake, her back against the wall, the baby asleep in her lap. She hadn't touched the bed. She hadn't even used the pillow. That day, Ethan asked around in town. He wanted to know more. One older vendor gave him a strange look when he showed her picture. "Her? That's the widow of Commander Yerrick's," he said. "She was once famous, brave, proud. Her mate died protecting a moon colony. After that, she just disappeared." Another merchant added, "I heard she was sold during the second slave raid." The shock broke her mind. They tried to retrain her, but she wouldn't obey. They say she screamed once for 3 days straight, then never spoke again. Ethan returned to the ship feeling sick. He didn't know her name, but he now knew her pain. She had been someone, a mother, a wife, a respected female. And now she was broken, quiet, almost invisible. That night, Ethan sat outside her room and left a warm bowl of soup on the floor near the door. She took it silently when no one was watching. On the third day, the child began coughing. A deep, chest-rattling cough. Ethan stepped into the room and saw her trying to warm the child's tiny hands with her own breath. He reached out with medicine. She didn't resist. She held the baby still while Ethan carefully gave the child a dose. That was the first time she looked at him, not with fear, not with suspicion, but with confusion. As if asking silently, "Why are you helping me?" He didn't answer. He just nodded and left. Days passed. She never spoke, but she began to respond in other ways. When Ethan gave her a towel, she nodded. When he brought fresh water, she reached for it without looking down. She started using the bed, though only when the child was sleeping deeply. Ethan watched carefully. Every small change mattered. She still hadn't smiled. She still didn't speak. But she was breathing more calmly. She blinked more often. She didn't flinch as much when someone moved near. One evening, Ethan sat across from her in the small kitchen area. He placed a soft piece of cloth on the table, clean, folded, and new. A dress, simple but beautiful. It was stitched by local women from nearby towns. He slid it across to her gently. She looked at it for a long time. Then, without a word, she folded it back up, stood, and placed it on the counter behind Ethan. She didn't want gifts. He understood. The next morning, as the ship prepared for liftoff, Ethan turned to her and said softly, "You can stay as long as you want, or leave when you wish. I will not keep you." Still, she said nothing, but when he stepped away, he saw her hand gently patting the child's back, her lips moving slowly. Not speaking, but trying. Relearning how to form sounds again. It wasn't much, but for a woman with no name, it was a start. And Ethan, deep down, believed that one day she would remember her name, not just with her lips, but with her strength. No. One would buy her, but he did. The slave market had a rule: never keep the ones no one wants. And she had been passed over too many times. Traders started calling her the ghost. She didn't talk, didn't cry, didn't scream, just sat there with the baby in her arms, barely moving. People said she was cursed, that even her child carried bad luck. Some believed she had lost her soul. No one wanted her, not even for free. But Ethan came back. He didn't understand why his mind kept returning to her, but it did. Maybe it was the way she held her child, like it was the last living piece of her. Or maybe it was the look in her eyes, not madness, not anger, just deep, quiet pain. A pain he couldn't forget. He stood before the old vendor once more. The man raised an eyebrow. "You again?" The vendor said with a grin, "Still thinking about the ghost mother? Look, human, I'll be honest. Nobody wants her. I've tried everything. I even lowered her price to 0. No one touches her. That thing's a lost cause." Ethan didn't flinch. "What's her number?" The vendor shrugged. "C-47. That's all we call her now." "Why? You collecting broken things?" Ethan didn't answer. He simply reached into his pouch and placed a single credit coin on the table. It wasn't much, but it was more than anyone had ever offered for her. The vendor chuckled. "You want the curse? Fine, take her. But don't come crying to me when she starts screaming in the night or bites your hand." Ethan took the ownership chip. The vendor tossed a ragged blanket at him and turned away. "Good luck, fool." When Ethan stepped into the holding area, some of the other slaves looked up. They expected him to choose someone strong, young, or obedient. But he passed them all and went straight to the corner. She was still there, quiet, still, and distant. Her child was asleep in her arms again, small arms wrapped tightly around her neck. Ethan knelt down. "I came back," he said softly. She didn't react. He held out the blanket not to cover her, but to let her know she was no longer a thing. She was a person. Someone worth giving to. Her eyes moved slowly to the cloth, then to him. For a second, just a second, her fingers moved as if to take it, but then stopped. Ethan didn't force it. He stood up and waited. She shifted the child gently in her arms, stood slowly, and followed him. No one clapped. No one noticed. To the others, it was nothing, but to her, it was the first time someone had chosen her. Not as property, not as labor, but as a person. On the way back to the ship, she didn't look up. Her feet dragged across the dust, but she didn't stop. She stayed close. And when a group of boys threw a stone at her and called her trash, Ethan turned around and stared them down until they ran. Inside the ship, Ethan showed her the same room safe, clean and warm. She sat on the floor again. She didn't ask questions. She didn't make sounds. But this time, when he handed her food, she nodded slowly. She still gave it to her baby first, but when the baby slept, she took a bite too. That night, Ethan didn't close the door. He wanted her to feel free. And in the early hours, he woke up and saw her standing in the doorway, holding her child, just watching him, not scared, not angry, just confused, like someone seeing kindness for the first time and not knowing what to do with it. He didn't speak. She turned back into the room and sat again. He smiled in the dark. No one would buy her, but he did. Not because she was useful, not because she was beautiful, but because she mattered. Even if the galaxy forgot her, he wouldn't. She had no name, but now she had a place. Asterisk, her first night under a roof, the stars outside were silent, glowing gently through the window of the small ship. For the first time in years, she was not sleeping under open sky or inside a cold, metal cage. She was inside a warm room, with soft light, clean air, and a door that didn't lock behind her. Still, she didn't sleep. Ethan had offered her the bed, a real bed with a blanket and pillow. But she didn't trust it. Beds were for people. She didn't think she was a person anymore. So she sat in the corner, her back against the wall, her legs crossed, the child resting in her lap. She stayed awake the whole night, blinking slowly, rocking the child whenever it stirred. Ethan watched her from the hallway. He had seen warriors, soldiers, and survivors, but none of them had this quiet strength. She didn't cry. She didn't ask for help. But she never let the child leave her arms, not even for a second. By morning, Ethan brought warm tea and soft bread. He placed them on the floor near her, just within reach. She looked at the food, then at him, and waited. Only when he stepped back did she touch it. She didn't eat. She crushed the bread gently with her fingers, softened it with tea, and gave it to the child. Ethan sat nearby, not saying anything. Words didn't work with her yet. She didn't need talk. She needed time, and he was ready to give it. Later that day, he cleaned the child's small injuries. The mother didn't stop him. She watched carefully, her fingers twitching slightly, ready to defend if needed. But when she saw Ethan treat the wounds with care and whisper something gentle to the child, her hands relaxed. Her eyes followed every move he made. She still didn't speak. But something behind her silence was changing. The ship moved slowly through space, far from the markets and cages of the city. Here, there were no traders, no chains, just silence and stars. That night, Ethan left the door to her room half open. If she wanted to close it, she could. If she wanted to leave, she could. Freedom was not something he forced. It was something he offered. When midnight came, he heard a soft sound, bare feet stepping into the hallway. He stayed still. She walked to the corner of the common room, holding her child tightly, and just stood there. Her eyes scanned the quiet space. There were no guards, no weapons, just silence. Slowly she walked back to her room, but this time she sat on the edge of the bed. She didn't sleep in it yet. She simply sat, gently swaying with the baby in her arms. It was as if she was trying to remember what safety felt like. The next morning, Ethan brought her something new, a small cloth toy. It was old and simple, a little stuffed animal that he had once kept from his childhood. He placed it near the baby and waited. She looked at the toy and didn't move for a long time. Then, gently, she reached out and touched it. She placed it next to the child and covered it with part of the blanket, as if protecting it too. Ethan smiled. She hadn't spoken. She hadn't smiled. But her actions were louder than words. That evening, as he walked past her room, he saw her sitting on the bed again. This time, the baby was sleeping beside her, and she was leaning against the wall, her eyes closed. For the first time, she had allowed herself to rest, not fully, but just enough to show trust. She still wore the same old clothes, refused new ones, and stayed quiet. But the fear in her eyes had faded slightly. Now there was something else: confusion. Maybe hope, maybe both. Ethan knew this journey would be long. Her mind had been wounded in ways he couldn't see. But he also knew something important. She was healing. Not because someone forced her, but because someone finally let her choose. Her first night under a roof was quiet, filled with small moments and silent understanding. And for the first time in a very long time, she wasn't just surviving. She was beginning to live again. Asterisk, her body healed, but her eyes stayed sad, her body. healed faster than expected. The bruises faded. The cuts on her hands closed. Her back straightened. Her steps became steady. The bones that once poked through her skin were now hidden under new strength. Her child, too, had changed. The baby no longer cried in pain but reached for small toys, smiled during sleep, and kicked its legs with growing life to everyone outside. It looked like she was getting better, but Ethan saw what others couldn't. Her body had healed, but her eyes stayed sad. She still didn't speak. She moved like someone walking through fog. Her face was calm, but never warm. When she looked at Ethan, it wasn't fear anymore, but it wasn't trust either. It was distance. A deep wall built behind her quiet gaze. Ethan didn't rush her. He never asked questions. He simply gave her space, and every day he offered something small. A fruit, a clean towel, a soft song from Earth's old music. Sometimes she accepted, sometimes she didn't, but she never turned violent. She never lashed out. She only existed silent, careful, distant. One afternoon, Ethan brought her a mirror. She had not seen her reflection in years. He placed it on the table and left the room. When he returned later, the mirror was gone. He found it turned face down on the shelf. She couldn't look at herself. Maybe she didn't recognize the person she had become. Maybe she didn't want to. Ethan began calling her by a name, Mira. It meant light in an old Earth language. He didn't know if she understood, but he hoped she would feel its meaning. At first, she gave no sign of hearing it. But one day, when the child crawled too close to the engine room and Ethan called out, "Mira," she turned her head sharply. She grabbed the baby and held it tight, eyes wide and alert. She had heard it, and somehow she knew it was for her. Still, she said nothing. One evening, Ethan came back from a long trip to the town's market. He had bruises on his arm and a cut near his jaw. A group of alien traders had tried to cheat him, and things got physical. It wasn't serious, but he was tired and bleeding when he stepped into the ship. Mira saw him from the hallway. She froze for a moment. Ethan saw something strange in her eyes, something sharp, like fear mixed with rage. Then she moved fast. She pulled open the medkit with trembling hands and sat him down. She didn't speak, but she pressed the cloth hard against the cut, cleaned the wound with strong focus, and wrapped his arm with perfect care. She didn't flinch at the blood. She didn't avoid his gaze. When it was done, she stood up and looked at him. Her hands were stained red, but she didn't seem to care. Ethan whispered, "Thank you." She stared for a long second. Then she nodded. It was the first real response. After that day, Mira began moving differently. She started opening doors herself, walking around the ship quietly, even preparing small meals. She didn't wait for permission anymore. She wasn't just reacting, she was choosing. But her eyes, they still held sorrow. Deep, unshakable sorrow. Ethan understood that some pain doesn't disappear. It just lives with you. And maybe, for now, that was okay. One night, as stars blinked across the black sky, Ethan sat outside and looked up. Mira stood beside him, holding her baby. She didn't sit, but she didn't leave either. After a long silence, Ethan spoke. "Do you remember who you were?" No answer. "I think you were strong." "I think you still are." The baby cooed softly. Mira looked down, kissed the child's forehead, and pulled the blanket tighter. Then, for the first time, she whispered something. A single word. In her own language. Ethan didn't understand it, but it sounded like a name long buried. And in that moment, the sadness in her eyes shifted just a little. Because maybe, somewhere deep inside, she was remembering who she was. She protected him like a mate. Mira had never touched Ethan before, not to hold him. Not even by accident. She kept distance like a rule, careful not to cross invisible lines. She accepted help, followed his lead, and cared for her child, but there was always space between them. That space was where her silence lived, where her fears still whispered until the night the hunters came. They came without warning. 3 alien men in dark coats, faces half covered, voices low and cruel. They were not there for a deal, they came to take. Slave hunters. Men who believed broken things belonged to them. Ethan was outside checking the ship's power lines. Mira had been watching from the window, her child sleeping in her arms. She saw them approach him. She saw one draw a blade, the others surrounding him. Ethan tried to talk, but it was clear they weren't listening. Then something inside her snapped. She didn't think. She moved. She placed the child safely in the small corner bed and ran, barefoot, silent, eyes wide with fire. The moment the first blade was raised, she threw herself between Ethan and the attacker. The metal edge caught her arm, slicing deep, but she didn't stop. She grabbed the attacker's wrist with both hands and twisted. The blade fell. Ethan shouted her name, Mira, but she didn't seem to hear it. She fought like someone who had once been trained. Not wild, not random. Her movements had purpose, strength, memory. The second hunter lunged, but she ducked and struck with her elbow. He stumbled back. Ethan jumped forward to help, but Mira was faster. She stood over him like a shield, her blood dripping, her breath hard. They ran when they saw her eyes cold and full of warning. By the time Ethan stood up, they were gone. He turned to her. Her hands were shaking. Her body was hurt. But she wasn't scared. She looked at him, blood on her arms, and for the first time she spoke clearly. Safe. Just one word. Then she collapsed. Ethan caught her before she hit the ground. He cleaned the wound, wrapped her arm, and held her hand through the night as she slept. The child curled beside her, tiny fingers clutching her shirt. She had saved him, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. The next day, when she woke, Ethan was there with food and water. She sat up slowly, blinking in the soft light. Her arm was wrapped neatly. Her child was playing with a small toy near her feet. Ethan smiled and whispered, "You protected me." She didn't respond. He nodded. "Thank you." Mira looked at the child, then back at Ethan. Her lips moved like she wanted to speak, but the words stayed stuck in her throat. Instead, she picked up a cloth and began to clean the blood from his jacket. It wasn't much, but it meant everything. That evening, something changed in how she moved around the ship. She didn't follow anymore. She walked beside him. She didn't look away. She met his eyes. When he gave her food, she didn't wait. She shared it with him. She even smiled once, small, soft, but real. She had been silent for so long that even these little moments felt loud. One night, Ethan sat on the ship's roof, watching stars. Mira stepped out quietly, holding her child close. She sat beside him, close. Her shoulder brushed his. She didn't move away. He didn't speak. After a few minutes, she whispered, "Your blood." Ethan looked at her. "What about it?" She paused. "When I saw it, I remembered my mate. I remembered when I lost him." Her voice shook. "I couldn't save him, but I saved you." Ethan's chest tightened. He reached for her hand, not forcefully, just enough to show her she didn't have to be alone. She let him, not because she was healed, but because she was healing. And in that moment, under the stars, with her child asleep in her lap and her hand in his, Mira wasn't just a lost alien mother anymore. She was something more. She was a protector. She was a fighter. She was a mate. Asterisk. She was no longer broken. She was his wife. Mira was no longer the same woman Ethan had first found curled up in the dirt. She still didn't speak much. She still woke in the middle of the night, holding her child tightly, heart racing from dreams she never spoke about. but something inside her had changed. The fear that once ruled her steps was now fading. Her silence was no longer empty, it was thoughtful. Her movements were no longer slow from pain, they were calm, purposeful, alive. Weeks passed, and Ethan noticed the small things first. She smiled when her child laughed. She folded the ship's blankets without being asked. She started humming again, but this time not to hide her pain. It was just a mother's soft tune for peace. When the child said its first clear word, "Mira," she cried, but didn't hide her tears. One morning, Ethan came back from the nearby station with supplies. He found Mira standing outside the ship, the child holding onto her leg. She was wearing the dress he had once given her, the one she had returned in silence. Now she wore it proudly. Her hair was tied back. Her eyes met his with calm strength. She spoke before he could. "I want to stay." The words were simple, but they hit Ethan like a wave. She had never said that before, not with words. She had followed, survived, obeyed. But now she chose. "You can," he said softly, "as long as you want." That evening, the three of them sat together around a small fire on a quiet planet's surface. The stars above were wide and open, like the future waiting for them. Mira looked at the child, then at Ethan. "I was a wife once," she whispered. "I wore silver robes and shared a home with a strong male, but he died. And after that, no one looked at me as a person again." She paused, voice low. "You did." Ethan didn't speak. He didn't want to break the moment. "I don't have silver robes anymore," she said, "but I want to be someone's wife again, yours." Ethan's eyes softened. He reached over and gently took her hand. "You already are," he whispered. "You've been since the day you shielded me with your own body." Mira blinked, then smiled, not a half smile, not a shy one, but full, open, and real. It was the first time he had truly seen her face without walls. The next morning, she stepped outside holding the child in one arm, her other hand resting on Ethan's shoulder. Traders at the market looked at her in surprise. Some recognized her, the ghost mother, the broken slave. But now, she walked with her head high. She didn't flinch. She didn't hide. She was no longer something to pity. She was the wife of a human who had seen her worth before she even remembered it herself. As they walked through the crowd, an old vendor whispered, "Is that her?" Another replied, "It can't be. She was useless." "No," the first said. "She was just waiting for the right hands." And they were right. Mira had not been saved by luck. She had been saved by love, not loud love, not perfect love, but steady love, the kind that waits, heals, and believes. She was no longer broken. She was strong, soft, and whole. She was his wife. And in a galaxy that had once called her worthless, Mira now walked proud because one human had dared to believe she was never worthless at all.